Operation Stormfury. How America's secret weather war nearly destroyed Southeast Asia. Welcome back to Untold Vietnam Chronicles, where we dive into the hidden stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. Tonight we're uncovering one of the most ambitious and catastrophic military programs in human history. America's secret attempt to weaponize the weather itself. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more shocking stories from Vietnam that sound too insane to be true. Like this video if you want to discover how the US military tried to play God with the atmosphere and accidentally created ecological disasters that are still affecting Southeast Asia today. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from our global community of history seekers. Now get ready, because tonight we're exploring Operation Stormfury, the classified program that turned hurricanes into weapons, droughts into military tactics, and nearly triggered a climate catastrophe that could have changed the planet forever. Chapter 1. Playing God with the Sky. The year was 1966, and the Vietnam War wasn't going according to plan. Despite superior firepower, advanced technology, and overwhelming air supremacy, American forces couldn't seem to defeat an enemy that melted into the jungle like morning mist. The Viet Cong controlled the weather advantage. They knew when the monsoons would come, when the dry season would provide cover, and how to use seasonal changes to maximize their tactical advantage. That's when someone at the Pentagon asked a question that would change warfare forever. What if we could control the weather ourselves? The concept wasn't entirely new. As early as 1946, American scientists had been experimenting with cloud seeding, injecting particles into storm systems to trigger or prevent rainfall. But what the military was now proposing went far beyond simple weather modification. They wanted to weaponize nature itself. Dr. Vinh Lang Ye, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist working with General Electric, had demonstrated that silver iodide particles could trigger precipitation in clouds. The military applications were immediately obvious: cause droughts in enemy territory, create floods to wash out supply lines, or generate storms to ground enemy aircrafts. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was briefed on the possibilities in a classified meeting that would remain secret for decades. The presentation, according to declassified documents, promised that weather control could provide decisive tactical advantages in unconventional warfare scenarios. The briefing materials claimed that weather modification could extend monsoon seasons to disrupt enemy supply routes, create localized droughts to destroy crops and force civilian populations to relocate, generate severe storms to ground enemy aircraft, and disable communication systems, and modify wind patterns to enhance the effectiveness of chemical weapons. Most ambitiously, the program promised to create environmental warfare capabilities that would be impossible for enemy forces to counter or even detect. Unlike conventional weapons, weather modifications would appear to be natural disasters, providing perfect cover for military operations. McNamara approved the program with a budget of $20 million per year, equivalent to over $150 million annually in today's money. The project was classified at the highest levels and given the innocuous code name Operation Stormfury. But what McNamara and his advisors didn't understand was that they were about to unleash forces that nobody could control. Chapter 2. The Weather Warriors. The heart of Operation Stormfury was established at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where a team of meteorologists, atmospheric physicists, and military engineers worked to transform basic cloud seeding technology into instruments of warfare. The team was led by Dr. Robert Simpson, a respected hurricane researcher who had been recruited from the National Hurricane Center. Simpson was a brilliant scientist who genuinely believed that weather modification could provide humanitarian benefits, reducing the severity of natural disasters, bringing rain to drought-stricken regions, and preventing agricultural catastrophe. But Simpson's humanitarian vision quickly became subordinated to military objectives. The Pentagon wanted weapons, not weather relief, and they wanted them deployed in Vietnam as quickly as possible. The technical challenges were enormous. Weather systems are incredibly complex, with small changes capable of producing massive, unpredictable consequences. The atmosphere is essentially a chaotic system, where minor modifications in one region can trigger major effects thousands of miles away. Despite these challenges, the Operation Stormfury team made rapid progress. They developed specialized aircraft capable of seeding clouds with silver iodide, aluminum particles, and other substances designed to trigger specific weather phenomena. They created computer models that predicted how atmospheric modifications would affect regional weather patterns. They even experimented with electromagnetic devices that could allegedly influence the electrical fields associated with storm formation. The first operational tests were conducted over the Gulf of Mexico in 1967. The results seemed promising. The team successfully modified the intensity and direction of several hurricanes, demonstrating that large-scale weather manipulation was indeed possible. But these early successes masked fundamental problems that would eventually lead to catastrophic failures. The computer models were based on incomplete understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The electromagnetic devices produced unpredictable side effects. Most critically, the team was focused on immediate tactical objectives, without considering the long-term environmental consequences of their activities. By 1968, Operation Stormfury was ready for deployment to Southeast Asia. The first weather modification missions over Vietnam were scheduled to begin in March, targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the critical dry season. None of the scientists involved had any idea they were about to trigger ecological changes that would affect the region for decades. Chapter 3: The Secret Sky War begins. The first weather modification mission over Vietnam took place on March 20. A specially modified C-30 aircraft, officially listed as conducting atmospheric research, flew over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and dispersed 50 pounds of silver iodide particles into cloud formations over the trail network. The mission was codenamed Operation Popeye, and its immediate objective was simple: extend the monsoon season by increasing rainfall over enemy supply routes, making them impassable for trucks and foot traffic. The initial results exceeded all expectations. Rainfall over the targeted areas increased by 300% over the following 3 weeks. Sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail became flooded rivers. Enemy supply operations were severely disrupted. Intelligence reports suggested that North Vietnamese forces were struggling to maintain their logistics networks in the face of unprecedented rainfall. Pentagon officials were ecstatic. Here was a weapon that was invisible, deniable, and seemingly unstoppable. Weather modification appeared to offer everything that conventional military force could not: the ability to defeat the enemy without risking American lives, without obvious escalation, and without violating international law. The program was rapidly expanded. By the end of 1968, weather modification missions were being flown over Vietnam on a weekly basis. The operations involved multiple aircraft, sophisticated tracking systems, and coordination with ground-based monitoring stations throughout Southeast Asia. But as the program expanded, strange things began happening. Rainfall patterns across the entire region started changing in unpredictable ways. Areas that had received artificial precipitation began experiencing severe droughts. Regions that hadn't been targeted started receiving excessive rainfall that caused flooding and agricultural damage. Most disturbing, the weather modifications seemed to be self-sustaining. Changes in rainfall patterns, triggered by cloud seeding operations, continued long after the aircraft had left the area. The atmosphere appeared to be remembering the modifications and amplifying them through natural feedback loops. Dr. Simpson and his team were puzzled by these unexpected results. Their computer models hadn't predicted such extensive secondary effects, and they didn't understand the mechanisms that were causing the changes to persist and spread. Unknown to the Operation Stormfury team, they had stumbled upon one of the most dangerous aspects of atmospheric manipulation: the butterfly effect. Chapter 4: The Monsoon That Wouldn't End. The summer of 1969 brought the most intense monsoon season in Southeast Asian recorded history. Rainfall levels were 500% above normal across Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and parts of Thailand. Rivers flooded, dams burst, and entire provinces were submerged under unprecedented amounts of water. At first, American military commanders celebrated what they saw as the ultimate success of their weather modification program. Enemy supply lines were completely cut off. The Viet Cong were forced to abandon camps and supply depots throughout the region. North Vietnamese regular forces found themselves isolated and unable to receive reinforcements or equipment. But the flooding didn't stop at enemy positions. American military bases were also inundated. Forward operating bases that had taken months to establish were washed away in a matter of days. Airfields became swamps, making close air support missions impossible. Supply convoys found their routes blocked by flooded roads and collapsed bridges. More seriously, the flooding was causing a humanitarian disaster among the civilian population. Millions of Vietnamese, Laotian and Cambodian civilians were displaced from their homes. Rice crops were destroyed, causing food shortages that would persist for years. Entire villages disappeared beneath the floodwaters, and the death toll from drowning, disease, and starvation began mounting. International relief organizations started reporting unprecedented levels of humanitarian crisis across Southeast Asia. The monsoon flooding was being described as a natural disaster on the scale of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. But it wasn't a natural disaster. It was the direct result of American weather modification operations. Simpson and his team were beginning to realize that they had lost control of the forces they had unleashed. The atmospheric modifications were creating feedback loops that were amplifying and perpetuating the weather changes far beyond anything they had intended. Computer models designed to predict the effects of cloud seeding operations were failing completely. The weather systems they had modified were behaving in ways that defied conventional meteorological understanding. Most alarming, the modifications seemed to be spreading beyond Southeast Asia. Unusual weather patterns were being reported across the Pacific Basin. Australia was experiencing unprecedented droughts. The Philippines were being hit by unusually severe typhoons. Even weather systems over the Central Pacific were showing anomalous characteristics that suggested they had been influenced by the Vietnamese operation. Chapter 5: The Butterfly Effect goes global. By late 1969, meteorologists around the world were documenting weather anomalies that couldn't be explained by natural causes. The jet stream over the Pacific was behaving erratically, creating unusual high and low pressure systems that were affecting weather patterns from Asia to North America. The winter of 1969-1970 brought the most severe weather in decades to large parts of the United States. Record snowfall, unprecedented cold snaps, and severe storms caused billions of dollars in damage and killed hundreds of people. The economic impact was devastating, with agriculture, transportation, and energy systems severely disrupted. Initially, these events were attributed to natural climate variability, but scientists who studied the patterns began to notice correlations that suggested the unusual weather was connected to atmospheric disturbances originating in Southeast Asia. Dr. Edward Lorenz, a meteorologist at MIT, who had developed the mathematical foundations of chaos theory, was among the first to suggest that the extreme weather might be the result of human intervention in natural systems. In a classified report that wouldn't be declassified until the 1990s, Lorenz warned that small modifications to complex atmospheric systems can produce large-scale, unpredictable changes in global weather patterns. He specifically noted that activities in Southeast Asia appeared to be creating cascade effects that were influencing weather systems thousands of miles away. The Operation Stormfury team was ordered to investigate these connections, but they found themselves dealing with atmospheric phenomena that exceeded their understanding and capability. The weather modifications they had initiated were interacting with natural climate systems in ways that created positive feedback loops, changes that amplified themselves and triggered additional changes. Most disturbing, the effects appeared to be accelerated. Each weather modification mission seemed to increase the instability of regional atmospheric systems, creating conditions that made future weather increasingly unpredictable and extreme. the scientists began to suspect that they had triggered something that couldn't be stopped. Chapter 6. The cover-up begins. As evidence mounted that Operation Stormfury was causing global weather disruptions, Pentagon officials faced a choice between admitting responsibility for potential climate catastrophe or covering up the program's existence. They chose cover-up. The decision was made at the highest levels of government, involving officials from the Defense Department, CIA, State Department, and White House. The consensus was that revealing the existence of weather modification operations would be politically and diplomatically catastrophic. International law was ambiguous about weather modification, but deliberately causing climate disasters that affected neutral countries would likely be considered an act of war. The legal, political, and economic consequences of admitting responsibility for global weather chaos could destroy American foreign policy and trigger massive claims for damages. The cover-up operation was extensive and sophisticated. Scientific data documenting the connections between weather modification operations and global climate anomalies was classified and removed from public access. Researchers who had studied the connections were reassigned to other projects or had their security clearances revoked. Media reports about unusual weather patterns were subtly discouraged through informal channels. Government weather services were instructed to avoid speculating about artificial causes of climate anomalies. International meteorological organizations found their funding reduced when they pursued research into human influences on weather systems. Dr. Simpson, who had become increasingly concerned about the global consequences of the program, was removed from his leadership position and reassigned to a desk job at the National Weather Service. His replacement, Dr. James Patterson, was a military meteorologist who was more focused on operational objectives than scientific ethics. Under Patterson's leadership, Operation Stormfury actually expanded. Instead of addressing the global climate disruptions, the program shifted focus toward maximizing the immediate military benefits of weather modification, while developing better techniques for concealing the artificial nature of the weather changes. Chapter 7. The Drought Wars. The winter of 1970-1971 brought a new phase of Operation Stormfury, deliberately induced droughts designed to destroy enemy agricultural capabilities and force civilian populations to relocate. The concept was elegantly simple. Instead of increasing rainfall over enemy territory, the weather modification aircraft would prevent precipitation by dispersing particles that inhibited cloud formation. This would create localized droughts that would devastate crops, dry up water sources, and make large areas uninhabitable. The first drought operations targeted regions of North Vietnam and eastern Laos, where agriculture supported both civilian populations and military forces. The results were immediate and devastating. Rainfall over targeted areas dropped by 80% during what should have been the wet season. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up completely. Rice crops failed across millions of acres, creating food shortages that affected not just military forces, but entire civilian populations. The humanitarian impact was catastrophic, but the military results were also impressive. Enemy forces in the targeted regions found themselves unable to sustain operations. Civilian populations began migrating away from the affected areas, reducing the pool of potential recruits and supporters for the insurgency. Encouraged by these successes, the Pentagon authorized expanded drought operations across much wider areas of Southeast Asia. By 1971, weather modification missions were targeting agricultural regions throughout Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but the drought operations had the same unpredictable effects as the earlier rainfall enhancement missions. The atmospheric modifications triggered cascading changes that spread far beyond the intended target areas. Natural rainfall patterns across Southeast Asia began shifting in ways that created both severe droughts and devastating floods. often in the same regions at different times of the year. The disrupted weather patterns made traditional agriculture impossible, forcing millions of people to abandon their homes and seek survival elsewhere. Chapter 8: The Ecological Collapse. By 1972, the accumulated effects of 4 years of intensive weather modification had created ecological disasters throughout Southeast Asia. The region's climate had been fundamentally altered, with consequences that affected every aspect of life for both humans and natural ecosystems. Traditional agricultural cycles had been completely disrupted. Farmers who had relied on predictable monsoon seasons for thousands of years found themselves facing weather patterns that defied all historical precedent. Rice production, which formed the foundation of the regional economy, dropped by 60% across much of the area. Natural ecosystems were collapsing under the pressure of extreme weather variability. Forests that had adapted to specific rainfall patterns were dying from either drought stress or waterlogging. Wildlife populations were crashing as their food sources disappeared and their habitats were destroyed. The human cost was staggering. The United Nations estimated that weather-related disruptions had displaced over 10 million people across Southeast Asia. Famine conditions existed in regions that had never experienced food shortages. Disease outbreaks were spreading through refugee populations that lacked access to clean water and adequate shelter. International relief organizations were overwhelmed by the scale of the humanitarian crisis. The situation was being described as the worst climate-related disaster in recorded history, but nobody understood that it was entirely artificial. The environmental effects were also spreading beyond Southeast Asia. Ocean temperatures in the Pacific were affected by changes in evaporation patterns caused by the modified rainfall. These temperature changes were influencing global ocean currents, which in turn affected climate patterns worldwide. Scientists studying global climate patterns were beginning to document systematic changes that suggested the Earth's entire climate system was becoming increasingly unstable. Ice core researchers noted unusual atmospheric chemistry that indicated unprecedented levels of artificial particles in the global atmosphere. Chapter 9: The Pentagon's Dilemma. By early 1973, Pentagon officials were facing an impossible situation. The weather modification program was achieving its immediate military objectives. Enemy forces were being severely disrupted by the artificial climate chaos, but the global environmental consequences were becoming so severe that they threatened to dwarf any possible military benefit. Intelligence reports documented widespread famine, ecological collapse, and social disruption across Southeast Asia. More alarming, similar effects were being reported in other parts of the world that appeared to be connected to the atmospheric modification. The 1973 oil crisis was partially attributed to unusual weather patterns that had disrupted global shipping and agricultural production. Economic disruptions in multiple countries were being traced to climate-related problems that seemed to originate with atmospheric disturbances over Southeast Asia. Most seriously, climate scientists were beginning to suggest that the atmospheric modifications might have triggered permanent changes in global climate systems. Computer models indicated that continued weather modification operations could potentially trigger irreversible climate change that would affect the entire planet. Dr. Peterson and his team were ordered to develop plans for ending the weather modification operations without revealing their existence or admitting responsibility for the environmental consequences. This proved to be an almost impossible challenge. Simply stopping the weather modification missions wouldn't necessarily end the atmospheric disruptions. The feedback loops that had been triggered by years of intensive modifications might continue indefinitely, regardless of whether additional interventions were made. More practically, stopping the weather operations would eliminate one of the most effective weapons in the American arsenal at a time when the Vietnam War was reaching its climax. Military commanders were reluctant to abandon a capability that was providing significant tactical advantages. Chapter 10: The Secret Shutdown. The decision to end Operation Stormfury was made not by military commanders, but by politicians who were terrified of the potential consequences of continued weather modification. In late 1973, Classified briefings revealed to senior government officials that the weather modification program might be causing permanent damage to global climate systems. The briefings included worst-case scenarios in which continued atmospheric modifications could trigger ice ages, desertification of entire continents, or catastrophic changes in ocean currents. President Nixon, who was already dealing with the Watergate scandal, was presented with evidence that his administration was potentially responsible for what could become the greatest environmental disaster in human history. The political calculus was simple. The potential consequences of continued weather modification far outweighed any possible military benefits. If the connection between American weather operations and global climate chaos was ever discovered, it would destroy American credibility and potentially trigger international conflicts that could escalate to nuclear war. The shutdown of Operation Stormfury was conducted with the same secrecy that had characterized the entire program. Weather modification missions ended abruptly in December 1973, with participating personnel told only that their operations had been reassigned to other projects. All equipment used for weather modification was either destroyed or transferred to civilian research institutions, with no indication of its previous military applications. Aircraft that had been modified for cloud seeding operations were converted to other uses or retired from service. Most importantly, all documentation relating to the weather modification program was classified at the highest levels and stored in ultra-secure facilities where it would remain hidden for decades. Chapter 11. The long-term legacy. The end of active weather modification operations didn't end the atmospheric chaos that had been triggered by 4 years of intensive intervention. The climate disruptions continued for years, gradually diminishing but leaving permanent changes in regional weather patterns. Southeast Asia's climate never fully recovered from the modification. Even today, rainfall patterns in the region remain different from historical norms, and agricultural cycles continue to be affected by the atmospheric changes that were triggered in the 90s. Atmospheric scientists studying historical climate data can identify signatures of the Vietnam-era weather modifications in ice cores, tree rings, and ocean sediments from around the world. Some climate researchers believe that Operation Stormfury may have been one of the first examples of anthropogenic climate change, human activities that altered global climate systems in ways that persist for decades or centuries. The technological legacy was also significant. The techniques developed for weather modification were later adapted for legitimate scientific research and civilian applications. Modern weather forecasting, climate research, and atmospheric chemistry all benefited from innovations that originated with the military weather modification program. But perhaps most importantly, Operation Stormfury demonstrated the dangers of attempting to manipulate complex natural systems without fully understanding their interconnections and feedback loop. The program showed how human intervention in one part of the Earth's climate system could trigger cascading changes that affected the entire planet. Chapter 12. The truth emerges. The existence of Operation Stormfury remained classified until 1974, when investigative journalists discovered references to weather modification operations in documents related to the Church Committee investigations of intelligence activity. The initial revelations were limited and focused primarily on the basic existence of the weather modification program. The full scope of the operations, their environmental consequences, and the connections to global climate disruptions wouldn't be revealed until the 1990s, when academic researchers gained access to previously classified documents. Even today, many aspects of Operation Stormfury remain classified. The complete environmental assessment of the program's effects has never been released to the public, and the full extent of the global climate impacts may never be known. However, enough information has emerged to establish that the Vietnam-era weather modification program was one of the most ambitious and dangerous military operations in human history. It demonstrated both the potential power and the catastrophic risks of attempting to weaponize natural systems. The program also revealed the ease with which environmental warfare could be disguised as natural disasters, making it impossible for victims to seek compensation or even recognition of the artificial nature of their suffering. Epilogue. Lessons from the storm. Operation Stormfury ended more than 50 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant to modern discussions about climate change, environmental warfare, and the ethics of atmospheric intervention. The program demonstrated that weather modification technology was indeed capable of producing large-scale climate changes, but it also showed that such changes were fundamentally unpredictable and potentially uncontrollable once initiated. Modern climate engineering proposals, such as solar radiation management, atmospheric carbon capture, and ocean fertilization, face similar challenges to those encountered by the weather modification program. They promise significant benefits, but carry risks of unintended consequences that could affect global environmental systems. The secrecy that surrounded Operation Stormfury also provides important lessons about the governance of environmental technology. The decision to weaponize weather modification was made without public debate, international consultation, or adequate scientific review. The consequences affected millions of people who never knew that their suffering was the result of deliberate human intervention. Today, as humanity faces the challenges of climate change and considers various technological interventions, the story of Operation Stormfury serves as a warning about the dangers of playing God with planetary systems. The atmosphere doesn't recognize national boundaries or military objectives. Changes to climate systems affect everyone, regardless of their involvement in or support for the activities that triggered those changes. Operation Stormfury showed that the power to control the weather is also the power to destroy civilization. It's a power that humanity has achieved, but whether humanity has the wisdom to use it responsibly remains an open question. In the end, Operation Stormfury succeeded in its immediate military objective. Weather modification helped disrupt enemy operations and provided tactical advantages for American forces, but the broader consequences, environmental destruction, humanitarian disasters, and long-term climate change, far exceeded any possible military benefit. The program achieved its goal of controlling the weather, but it also lost control of the consequences. That may be the most important lesson of all. In dealing with complex natural systems, the power to intervene is much easier to acquire than the wisdom to intervene safely. The sky above Vietnam still bears the scars of America's attempt to weaponize the weather, and the Earth's climate continues to reflect the echoes of storms that were artificially created and artificially sustained 50 years ago. Some weapons are too dangerous to use, even when using them might help you win. Operation Stormfury proved that the weather is one of those weapons.